今天我们就开始了。Now let's start today's sharing, and we will analyze the news of the Federal Reserve and talk something about the behavior of the China's economy. Okay, first I would like to share this part. I will read this part first. We would ignore the part of the behavior of the financial situation. Okay, and directly into this part, the start review of the let's see of the economy. Hold on a second. The review of the economic situation. Okay, the information available at the time of July 24, 25 to 26 meeting suggest that the real gross domestic product GDP rose at a more moderate pace of the first half of the year. The labor market remained very tight, although the imbalance between demand and supply in the labor market was gradually dismissing. Consumer price inflation as measured by the 12-month percentage change in the price index for PCE, that is personal consumption expenditure, remained elevated in May, and available information suggests that inflation declined but remained elevated in June. In the second quarter, total non-farm payroll employment posted the slowest average monthly increase since the recovery began in mid-2020. Although the payroll gains remained robust compared with those seen before the pandemic. Similarly, the private sector job openings rates, as measured by the job openings and labor turnover survey, fell in May to its lowest level since March 2021, but remained well above per-pandemic levels. The unemployment rate edged down to 3.6% in June, while the labor force participant rate and the employment to population ratio was both unchanged. The unemployment rates for African Americans and however both rose and were well above the national average. The average hourly earnings rose 4.4% over the 12 months ending in June, compared with a year early increase of 5.4%. Consumer price inflation continued to show signs of easing, but remained elevated. Total PCE price inflation was 3.8% of the 12 months ending in May, and core PCE price inflation, which excludes changes in energy prices and many consumer foods prices, was 4.6% over the same period. The main measure of 12 months PCE price inflation constructed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas was 4.6% in May. In June, the 12 months change in the CPI was 3%, while the core CPI inflation was 4.8% of the same period. Measures of the short-term inflation expectations had moved down alongside actual inflation, but remain above per-pandemic levels. In contrast, the measures of medium to long-term inflation expectations were in the range seen in the decade before the pandemic. Available indicators suggest that the real GDP rose in the second quarter at a pace similar to the one posted in the first quarter. However, private domestic final purchases, which include PCE, residential investment, and business fixed investment, and which often provides a better signal of underlying economic momentum than does GDP, appeared to have decelerated in the second quarter. Manufacturing output rose in the second quarter, supported by a robust increase in motor vehicle production. After falling sharply in April, real exports of goods picked up in May, led by higher exports of industrial supplies and automotive products. Real goods imports fall as lower imports of consumer goods and industrial supplies more than offset higher imports of capital goods. The nominal U.S. international trade deficit narrowed as a sharp decline in nominal imports of goods and services outpaced a decline in exports. The available data suggest that the net exports subtracted from the U.S. GDP growth in the second quarter. Indicators of the economic activity, such as purchasing managers index, pointed to a step down in the pace of foreign growth in the second quarter, reflecting fading of the impetus from the China's reopening, continued anemic growth in Europe, some weakening of activity in Canada and Mexico, as well as weak external demand and the slump in the high technology industry, weighing on many Asian economies. Incoming data also indicated that global manufacturing activity remained weak during the intermeeting period. The foreign headline inflation continued to fall, reflecting in part the pass-through the previous declines in commodity prices to retail energy and food prices. Core inflation edged down in many countries, but generally remained high. In this context, and amid the tight labor market conditions, many AFE central banks raised the policy rates and they underscored the need to raise rates further or hold them at sufficiently restrictive levels to bring inflation in their country back to their targets. In contrast, central banks of emerging market economies largely remained on hold, and some indicate that a rate cut is possible at their next meeting. Staff review of the financial situation. The financial situation, okay, so let's finish this part. Over the intermeeting period, market participants interpret the domestic economic data released as indicating continued resilience of economic activity and some easing of inflationary pressures. And they viewed monetary policy communications as pointing to somewhat more restrictive policy than expected. The market implied path for the federal funds rate rose modestly, and nominal treasury yields increased somewhat at shorter maturities. Meanwhile, broad equity prices increased, and the spreads on investment and speculative great corporate bonds narrowed moderately. Financing conditions continued to be generally restrictive, and the borrowing costs remained elevated. Over the intermeeting period, the market implied path for the federal funds rate rose modestly, while the timing of the path slightly higher peak moved a little later. To just after the November meeting. Beyond this year, the policy rate path implied by overnight index swap (OIS) course and the period moderately higher. Yields on the treasury securities increased moderately at shorter maturities, but only a bit at longer maturities. Measures of inflation compensation rose only slightly for near-term and long-term maturities. Measures of uncertainty about the path of policy rates derived from the interest rate options remain very elevated by historical standards. Broad stock price index increased, and the spreads on investments and Respective grade corporate bonds narrowed moderately over the intermeeting period. The VIX, the 1 month option implied volatility on the S&P 500 edged down and ended the period near the 25 percentile of its historical distribution. Bank equity prices increased and the outperformed the S&P 500 modestly. Stock prices for the largest banks fully recovered from their declines in the immediate wake of the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, while those for regional banks remained below the levels seen in early March. Short-term interest rates in the AFEs increased moderately on net over the intermeeting period, as foreign central banks continued to raise policy rates and signal the potential for further tightening. Increases in yields were tempered, however, by downside surprise to both inflation and PMIs from some economies. Risk sentiment in foreign markets improved somewhat, with most foreign equity index increasing and the foreign corporate and emerging markets, the sovereign bond spreads narrowing. The staff trade weighted bond broad dollar index declined moderately, with the largest moves following release of the weaker than expected U.S. labor market data and lower than expected U.S. inflation data. Conditions in domestic short-term funding markets remained generally stable over the intermeeting period. Spreads in unsecured markets narrowed modestly and a slight increase in OIS rates. Following the suspension of the debt limit, the Treasury Department partly replenished the TGA, where a large net increase in bill issues. Auctions of Treasuries were met with robust demand as short-term bill yields increased relative to other money market rates. Money market funds increased their holdings of Treasury bills and reduced their investments, with the overnight repurchasing agreement facility or overnight reverse repurchasing facility declined notably, about $390 billion over the intermeeting period, reflecting more attractive rates on some alternatives to investing in the overnight reverse repurchasing facilities. Despite reduced overnight reverse repurchasing take up, money funds maintained relatively high asset allocations in overnight repurchasing agreement investments and still elevated uncertainty about the future path of policy. In domestic credit markets, borrowing costs for business, households, and municipalities were little changed over the intermeeting period and remained elevated by historical standards. Use on agency commercial mortgage-backed securities, CMBS, were little changed. The banking sector's ability to fund loans to business and consumers were generally stable during the intermeeting period. Core deposit volume at both large and other domestic banks held steady at the levels that they reached in early May, after having declined sharply in March and April. Amid the banking sector turmoil, banks continued to attract inflows of large-time deposits, reflecting higher interest rates offered on new certificates of deposit. Meanwhile, the wholesale borrowing, which primarily consists of advanced from Federal Home Loan Banks, loans from the Bank Term Funding Program, and other credit extended by the Federal Reserve, had fallen since May by domestic banks of all sizes, particularly reversing the surge at the onset of the bank turmoil in March. Credit availability for business appeared to tighten somewhat in recent months. Credit from capital markets was somewhat subdued, but overall remained accessible for larger corporations. Issuance of leverage loans remained limited, reflecting low level of leveraged buyout and merger and acquisition activity, as well as weak investor demand in the municipal bond market. Gross issuance was solid in June, and both refundings and new capital issuance picked up from somewhat subdued May. Commercial and industrial loan balances contracted modestly in the second quarter, and the commercial real estate loan growth on banks' books continued to moderate. In the July senior law officer opinions reign on bank lending practice. Banks reported having tightened standards and terms on the commercial and investment laws to firms of the all size in the second quarter. The most cited reason for tightening the commercial and investment standards and terms continued to be concerns about the economic outlook. Banks also reported expecting to tighten commercial and investment standards further over the remainder of the year. The July SLOOS also indicated that the standards across all CRE loan categories tightened further in the second quarter, and the banks expected to tighten CRE standards further over the second half of the year. Meanwhile, the commercial mortgage-backed securities issuance picked up a bit in May and then ticked down in June after recording low volume early in the year. Credit in the residential mortgage market remained broadly available for high credit score borrowers who met standard confirming loan criteria. Only a modest percentage of banks in the July SLOOS reports tightening standards for mortgage loans eligible to be purchased by government-sponsored enterprises, while a moderate percentage of banks reported expecting to tighten lending standards further for those loans over the second half of the year. Meanwhile, the availability of mortgage credit remained tighter for households with the lower credit scores at levels close to those prevailing before the pandemic. Bank reported in the SLOOS that they had tightened the standards for certain categories of residential real estate loans to be held on their balance sheets, such as jumbo loans and home equity lines of credit. In addition, banks reported expecting to tighten standards for jumbo loans during the remainder of 2023. Conditions remained generally accommodative in consumer credit markets, which credit available for most borrowers. Credit card balances increased in the second quarter, though at a somewhat slower pace than in the previous months. In July, SLOOS banks reported expecting to continue tightening lending standards for credit card loans. Overall, the credit quality of most business and households remains solid, while there were signs of deterioration in credit quality in some sectors, such as the office segment of CRE. The liquidity rates generally remained near the pre-pandemic lows. The credit quality of the commercial investment and the commercial real estate loans on banks' balance sheets remained sound as of the end of the first quarter of 2023. However, in July, slow banks frequently cited concerns about the credit quality of both the commercial real estate and other loans as reasons for expecting to tighten their lending standards over the remainder of the year. Aggregate the liquidity rates pools of the commercial mortgage-backed backing CMBS increased in May and June. The staff provided updates on its assessments of the stability of financial system and on balance, categorized the financial vulnerabilities of U.S. financial system as notable. So let me back to see if anyone here. Okay. So hold on. Let me continue my reading. Okay. So if you have any questions, just type here, and let's do more kind of sharing. In particular, the measures of the valuation in both residential and commercial property markets remain high relative to fundamentals. House prices, while having cooled early this year, started to rise again, and the price to rent ratio remained at an elevated level and near those seen in the mid-2000s. Although commercial property prices moved down, developments in the commercial real estate sector following the pandemic may have produced a permanent shift away from traditional working patterns. If so, fundamentals in the sector could decline notably and contribute to a deterioration in credit quality. So let's see anything. Okay. The staff also, we're very close to this part, the staff economic outlook. The economic forecast prepared for the staff for the July of the Federal Open Market Committee meeting was stronger than in June projection, since the emergence of the strikes in the banking sector in mid-March. Indicators of spending and real activity had come in stronger than anticipated. As a result, the staff no longer judged the economy would enter a mild recession toward the end of the year. However, the staff continued to expect that the real GDP growth in 2024 and 2025 would run below their estimated potential output growth, leading to a small increase in the unemployment rate relative to its current level. The staff continued to project that the total and core PCE price inflation would move lower in coming years. Much of the step down in core inflation was expected to occur over the second half of the 2023, with forward-looking indicators pointing to a slowing in the rate of increase of housing services prices, and with the core non-housing services prices and the core goods prices expected to decelerate over the remainder of 2023. Inflation was anticipated to ease further over 2024 as demand-supply imbalance continued to resolve by 2025. Total PCE price inflation was expected to be 2.2%, and the core inflation was expected to be 2.3%. The staff continued to judge that the risks to the baseline projection for real activity were titled to the downside. Risks to the staff baseline inflation forecast were seen as skewed to upside, given the possibility that inflation dynamics would prove to be more persistent than expected, that further adverse shocks to support conditions might occur. Moreover, the additional monetary tightening that would be necessitated by higher or more persistent inflation represented a downside risk to the projection for real activity. Participants' view on the current conditions and the economic outlook. We are very close to this part. In the discussions of current economic conditions, participants noted that economic activity had been expanding at a moderate pace. Job gains had been robust in recent months, and the unemployment rate remained low. Inflation remained elevated, but participants agreed that the U.S. banking system was sound and resilient. They committed that tighter credit conditions for households and business were likely to weigh on economic activity, hiring, and inflation. However, participants agreed that the extent of these effects remained uncertain. Again, against this background, the committee remained highly attentive to inflation risks. Assessing the economic outlook, participants noted that the real GDP growth had continued to exhibit the resilience in the first half of the year, and the economy had been showing considerable momentum. A gradual slowing down in economic activity nevertheless appeared to be in progress, consistent with the restraints placed on demand by the cumulative tightening of monetary policy since early last year and associated effects of the financial conditions. Participants remarked on the uncertainty about the lags in the effects of monetary policy on the economy and discussed the extent to which the effects on the economy stemming from the tightening that the commercial had undertaken had already materialized. Participants commented that the monetary policy tightening appeared to be working broadly as intended, and that continued gradual slowing in real GDP growth would help reduce demand-supply imbalances in economy. Participants assessed that the ongoing tightening of credit conditions in banking sector, as evidenced in the most recent surveys of banks, also would likely weigh on economic activity in coming quarters. Participants noted the recent reduction in total and core inflation rates. However, they stressed that inflation remained unacceptably high and that the further evidence would be required for them to be confident that inflation was clearly on a path toward the committee 2% objective. Participants continue to view a period of below trend growth in real GDP and some softening in the labor market conditions as needed to bring aggregate supply and aggregate demand into better balance and reduce inflation pressures sufficiently to reach inflation to 2% over time. Participants noted that consumer spending had recently exhibited a considerable resilience, underpinned by in aggregate strong household balance sheets, robust job and income gains, a low unemployment rate, and the rising consumer confidence. Nevertheless, tight financial conditions, primarily reflecting the cumulative effect of the committed shift to a restrictive policy stance, were expected to contribute to slower growth in consumption in the period ahead. Participants stated that other factors that were likely leading to or appeared consistent with a slowdown in consumption, including the declines stocks excess savings, softening labor market conditions, and increased price sensitivity on the part of customers. Some participants observed that the recent increase in home prices suggests that the housing sector responded to monetary policy restraints may have peaked. In their discussion of business sector, participants cited various improvements in firms' cost structures. These included better functioning supply chains, lower input costs, and increased ability to hire and retain workers. Participants also discussed conditions that could lead to higher economic activity, such as leaner inventories and reduce the expectations of a sub-economic slowdown, and factors that could lead to lower economic activity, such as continuing economic uncertainty, the vulnerability of the CRE market, and the ongoing weakness of manufacturing output. Participants judge that over coming quarters, firms would reduce the pace of their investment spending and hiring in response to tight financial conditions and the slowing of economic activity. Participants remarked that the labor market continued to be very tight, but pointed to signs that demand and supply were coming into better balance. They noted evidence that labor demand was easing, including declines in job openings, lower quit rates, more part-time work, slower growth in hours worked, higher unemployment insurance claims, and more moderate rates of the nominal wage growth. In addition, they remarked on indications of increasing labor supply, including further rise in the primary age participation rate to a post-pandemic high. Participants also observed, however, that although growth in payrolls had slowed recently, it continued to exceed values consistent over time with unchanged unemployment rate, and the nominal wages were still rising at rates above levels assessed to consist with the sustained achievement of the committee's 2% inflation objective. Participants judged the further progress towards a balancing of demand and supply in the labor market was needed, and they expected that the additional softening in labor market conditions would take place over time. Participants cited a number of tentative signs that inflation pressures could be abating. That sign included some softening in core goods prices, lower online prices, evidence that firms were raising prices by smaller amounts than previously, slower increase in shelter prices, and the recent declines in serene estimates of shorter-term inflation expectations and of inflation uncertainty. Various participants discussed the continued stability of long-term inflation expectations at levels consistent with 2% inflation over time, and the role that the committee's policy tightening had played in delivering these outcomes. Nevertheless, several participants comment that the significant these inflation pressures had yet to become apparent in the prices of core services, excluding housing. Participants observed that the notwithstanding recent favorable development, inflation remained well above the committee's 2% long-term objective, and that the elevated inflation was continuing to harm business and households. Low-income families, in particular, participants stressed that the committee would need to see more data on inflation and further signs that aggregate demand and aggregate supply were moving into better balance to be confident that inflation pressure were abating, that the inflation was on course to return to 2% over time. Okay, so it seems哦，很卡顿，哦，这个是很糟糕的事情，是不是？So what should I do?